Clément Beaune, who is the French Minister of State for European Affairs, Franziska Brantner, who is a member of the Bundestag. She belongs to the Green Party, as indeed her sweater shows. And Mark Leonard, whom we all know, our friend Mark, who runs the European Council on Foreign Relations. The idea this afternoon is to discuss the best way for us Europeans, now that the Biden administration has been in place for almost 2 months, what is the best way for us Europeans to promote and protect our own values and interests? Is there room to try and shape up a new kind of transatlantic honeymoon? There was, of course, wild applause when Joe Biden and his team were elected. However, and it shows this very week, that indeed the priorities of the Biden administration, it's not Europe. We see that Antony Blinken and the new boss of the Pentagon have gone to Japan and South Korea, I believe. The president himself took part in a video discussion with the presidents of India, the Prime Minister of Australia, the Prime Minister of Japan, and obviously the priority is China. And indeed, Blinken and Jake Sullivan will meet with their Chinese counterparts in Anchorage, Alaska next Thursday. So how do we Europeans play our part? I suggest, Mark, that you start, as indeed ECFR ran a very interesting study, a poll, but also a very interesting study that you commented together with Ivan Krastev. So the floor, so to speak, is yours.
Thank you very much, Christine. It's wonderful to be chaired by you and discussing these big topics with you, and very happy to be with Clément and Franziska as well. I'm just going to quickly run through a few slides which look at the results from our big pan-European poll, which we did just after the US elections at the end of last year, which I think provides a really interesting window into both a remarkable convergence which has taken place between Paris and Berlin in terms of how they look at the world. And I think Donald Trump has both had an enormously important effect on how French and German citizens, as well as those in many other countries, look at the US and the world, but has also created, I think, quite a complicated legacy for Biden, because a lot of the results that we see show quite a complicated beginning to the transatlantic relationship in the minds of many Europeans. In one sentence, what this poll shows, and I'm not going to have a chance to go through all of the different data, so you'll have to take my word for it, but is that Europeans were enormously happy that Biden was elected, felt that the US was on the wrong track under Trump. And that was something which united people from East and West, North and South of Europe at the level of public opinion. Even if some governments seemed to be very close to Trump, their populations were much less close to him. However, in spite of that, there was a lot of skepticism about the ability of the United States to come back to a position of global leadership. And I think that is leading Europeans both to think differently about the global order, but also to think differently about one another. And that's what's most interesting about this survey. So I'll start with the sort of analysis about the legacy of Trump. And essentially, we found that most Europeans in most countries felt that the American political system was broken. But in some countries, there are also a very large number of people who felt that America is now unreliable as an ally after they voted for Donald Trump. And this slide is particularly interesting in Germany. If you look at it, you can see that 53% of Germans agree with the statement that after voting for Trump in 2016, Americans can't be trusted. it's a lot higher actually than the poll in France, where only 26% say that. But maybe Germans started with a higher level of faith in the American people than their French counterparts did before. So France had less far to fall. But as well as not trusting American politics, there's also a real sense that American power is declining. And we found that a majority of Europeans, just under 60%, think that China is going to be a stronger power than the US within 10 years. And that is very true of Germany and France as well. In France, it's well over 60%. In Germany, it's almost 60% of people who believe that. And maybe most strikingly in terms of the Franco-German perceptions is the next slide, where we ask people how much they depended on the American security guarantee. And the most interesting column here is the one on the far left, the one in dark blue, where these people said that they need the US security guarantee a great deal. So this is the group of people who think that it's an existential matter. And what is very surprising is that apart from in Poland, in very few countries, in no country does a substantial proportion of the population feel that it is an existential matter. But in France and in Germany, it's only 1 in 10 people who think that. And almost a third of people in Germany and a third of people in France think that we don't need the American security guarantee very much, or indeed at all. And that is, I think, quite a striking convergence in Franco-German sentiments. So from these findings, what you find are some quite radical ideas about the future of the transatlantic relationship and the future of European foreign policy. A lot of which I think are probably quite encouraging from the perspective of Clément and the government which he's been part of, pushing for European sovereignty, for strategic autonomy, but some which are more sobering. So the first question, which was very striking, was this question about China, which is where Christine started the discussion. The top issue on the Biden agenda is to try and get allies to make common cause with the United States in an attempt to shape China's rise. But what we found is that a majority of people in every single country that we polled does not want to take the US side if there is a disagreement between Washington and Beijing. We first discovered this a couple of years ago, but we thought a lot of people in Washington that I spoke to thought that this was very much a Trump finding. This is quite sobering because it shows that going into the Biden administration, 60% of Europeans want to stay neutral, whereas only 22% want to take the US side. And again, there's very little difference between France and Germany. In fact, strikingly, there are more French people who want to take America's side than Germans. At 25% of French people is only 16% of Germans. The second, we see a similar picture when it comes to relations with Russia. The second angle is about investing in European defense. We gave people these two options. Europe can't always rely on the US. We need to look after our own defense capabilities, and the US will always protect Europe, so we don't need to worry too much about them. And there you see a large majority of Europeans who agree that Europe can't always rely on the US and we need to look after our own defense capabilities. There is more support for this in France than in Germany, but it's still, even in Germany, it's 60% who agree with that, only 13% who disagree with it. And in France, it's 70%. So it's quite similar. But maybe most interesting is this question about who people look to in terms of the most important relations. And what you find from this, when people are given a collection of capitals to which they are looking to as the 3 most important countries, is that Europeans are typically looking towards one another. So 38% of Germans said that they are looking at France, compared to only 35% who are looking to Washington. And in France, as well as many other countries like Denmark, Spain, Hungary, the Netherlands, Sweden, and Portugal, sorry, not quite Sweden, but Portugal, a majority of people look to Berlin rather than Washington as their #1 country. The figures are slightly less good from a Paris perspective. In Spain, there are 18% of people who look to Paris, but in most countries, it's either Berlin or Washington that is seen as the sort of key partner. So these are quite, I think, striking in terms of the convergence of Europeans. There is, however, one big difference between Paris and Berlin, and maybe I will end with that, which is the question of where this feeling of the need to look at European sovereignty comes from. And it's because power is seen as a sort of relative force. And what we tried to do in this survey was to look at how people perceived Europe's and America's and China and Russia's and other kind of countries' positions on the power stakes. And we gave them 4 options. Firstly, those who think that Europe is working well and the US is doing badly. A second group are people who, we called them In Europe We Trust. A second group of people who think that the US is doing well, but Europe is doing badly. And then we had a group called In the West We Trust, which is people who think that both Europe and America are going to be doing well in the next century. And the final group, which we called In Decline We Trust, who think that Europe and America are both declining and that the future belongs to Russia and China. What you see from this is quite a big difference in perspectives between France and Germany. Across Europe as a whole, the people on the right side, In Europe We Trust and In the West We Trust, are ones who think that the future is rosy from a European perspective, 55% of the population. And you have 29% of the population who think that Europe and America are declining, and 9% who think that Europe is declining, but America is doing okay. But if you look at the difference between France and Germany, you can see that in Germany, the biggest groups are optimistic, 53% In Europe We Trust, 16% In the West We Trust. And only 20% think that Europe and America are declining. Whereas in France, the biggest group are the declinists. And you have a much smaller group of people, only 25%, who think that Europe is going to do well and the US is doing badly. Anyway, I just wanted to give you a flavor of some of the findings. Very much looking forward to the discussion about what this actually means in practice for the future of European foreign policy, for European sovereignty, for Franco-German relations, and for the wider EU. And we'll let Clément and Franziska open that up, and happy to answer any questions later on.
Thank you, Mark. Clément, Beaune, I think we're all eager to see how you react to so much data, which on the one hand does show a rather united view from many Europeans from various countries as to the need for Europe to rely on themselves. But of course, there's always the special relationship between Paris and Berlin, and especially the last figures that Mark commented, the French being pessimistic and the Germans more optimistic. So what is your take?
Thank you very much, Christine. I'm very happy to have this discussion with you, even if, as you say, mentioning the floor, we would have preferred to have lateral floor and to meet for real, but I hope that with you, Franziska, Mark, and others, we will be able to do soon. I was very interested to see again this data, because I must say, maybe it's not the focus of today's discussion, but it's always a bit sad, how should I say, probably sad, to see that in the 11 countries, I think you surveyed, France is not very central in the countries where with which the relation should be strong or should be developed. When you look at Denmark, Netherlands, and others, the focus on the US, of course, but on Germany is much stronger, which I think is also, not to be too long on this, but shows that the direction we decided to take 4 years ago, nearly 4 years ago, with President Macron, to invest a lot in bilateral relations within the EU is extremely important, and it's a long-term investment, if I may put it like that, but we have to do this. The second thing is that, as you said, And I think it has, of course, a link with the way we approach the EU and the transatlantic relation. The pessimism in the French public opinion is strong. It's not totally a scoop, but I think this survey shows it again. And it's probably because, you may say I'm biased, and I am obviously, but that in our domestic debate in France, we sold a lot Europe, the EU, over decades. We gave it up after 2005, when what was sold by French politicians a lot of times was France, or Europe would be France in bigger version of France. And of course, when you say that, you create disappointment at some points. Not because we didn't manage well, maybe we did as well, but not because we did not manage to defend our ideas, vision, sometimes interest in the European debate and the European stage. I think we did, like the others, but because there was obviously a misunderstanding from the beginning about what the EU was about. It cannot be a big Germany, a big France, a big Spain, or whatever of this kind. Does not mean that we do not increase, I'm convinced about this, our leverage, the defense of our interests, the defense of our values as a country, France, Germany, or others. I'm convinced in this project. But if you present it as the copycat of your country in a bigger version, you create disappointment. Just to say this, and to say that after we had this, we hit the wall, if I can put it like that, in 2005 with the lost referendum and the Constitutional Treaty in France and the Netherlands, we just gave it up and we left the floor to Eurosceptics, to put it mildly, or strongly anti-European forces in our country. So now there is no hope, sufficiently at least, in the European projects. And if you look at national powers, their influence as a country, and you do not trust at the same time the European Union to compensate this loss of impact, you create a kind of gap in which people see no positive perspective for their country, France in this case, and for Europe as a power. Just to say that very quickly, what I think should be reassuring paradoxically, especially from a French point of view in this context, is, as Mark described in this survey, the level of convergence in what could be sold. That's why I'm talking about the paradox as a French perspective to some extent. In this survey and beyond, we have indicators quite recently that the idea of sovereignty, the idea of power, the idea of acting as Europeans, the idea of trusting your closest or main European partner, France for Germany, Germany for France, the idea that we should be not hostile, of course, but sometimes tough, united and firm in our own interests defense with the US. All these ideas have developed a lot across Europe over the last years. There is probably a Trump effect in this respect, and there's probably a counter effect called Biden to some extent, of course. I think it goes beyond. I think there's an effect of Brexit, and there is a Chinese effect, I would say. I'm quite convinced, although I don't have myself scientific figures to emphasize this intuition or this feeling, but I'm totally convinced that the feeling of Europeans is that they can be just hit between the US and China, mainly by China, and that they have an intuition that if they do not organize collectively, they will not survive, whatever survive exactly means. We will not physically disappear, but economically, technologically. And we see that in this interesting debate we have across Europe through the vaccine. I think we have a lot of pragmatic criticism, relevant criticism in our common European campaign. We could go back to this, but mainly it's painful because it strengthens the feeling that we are not leading. We are not leading in science, we are not leading in innovation, which should be nuanced, I think. But the deep feeling or the spontaneous feeling is that the others are quicker than us, are better than us, are more innovative than us. And this, especially in France, but I think it has an echo in all EU countries. I know Franziska will correct me if it's not the true description of reality is, I think, the same in Germany, probably to slightly lesser extent. It echoes this fact that was, I think, well described in the survey. Maybe just a word, because this is also what gathers us this afternoon, about the transatlantic dimension in all this and the new Biden context, I would say. I think there will be, if I can try to describe or anticipate as far as we can the situation now, there are three boxes, I would say, in the transatlantic relation. I think there is a first one, to be a bit provocative, which will be America first, meaning that Mr. Biden, President Biden, will defend US interests because Trumpism has not come from nothing or from nowhere, because it's still there, because as an American president, basically he defends American interests and we should not expect something different. Vaccination, we will see, may be a test of this, or an evidence of this. We see the tension globally about exports, about deliveries and so on. The US will be a tough player, of course, in this competition. I think there will be areas of nicer cooperation, if I can use simple words. Climate, for sure. It will be probably, there will be probably a competition for leadership between the US and the EU, but it is good news. I think in substance, we will be quite close to the new US administration. And there will be, I think, a larger box where I think the behavior of the US will be smiling and waiting, if I can sum it up like this. I think trade will be one of these. We will appease tensions probably, but the US will not give up even the Trumpist approach of sometimes tensions bilaterally in the US-EU relation. And I think a lot of elements of competing models will be in this basket, will fall in this box. Digital, for instance. We have positive signals from the US about the fact they are ready to discuss digital taxation at the international level. But not optimistic, but there might be an option in which the US will be open, but take some time, wait, to be a bit blunt, play with us, because it's the best way to make sure the Europeans will not act too fast or alone. And also because they have domestic debates in the US about these elements of regulation, for instance. I think, for instance, China, the relation with China, the way we reshape in this Chinese power context, the rules of international trade, WTO reform and so on, might be probably in between box 3 and box 2, because we will have different interests, but I think we should, as Europeans, promote a US-EU cooperation in this respect. I don't want to be too long, but I think we will have a new transatlantic partnership to define. What I think is most interesting is we always ask the question to ourselves, what does the change in Washington change for us? And even the question says something about the fact we are still not ready, or not fully ready, probably more ready, as the survey shows, to define as Europeans, firstly, our values, our interests, our model, our common cooperation, before going to Washington and seeing where we can cooperate less or more. I think this work, this homework of defining our own agenda, the way we want to approach the transatlantic agenda, and then we see with the US if we can find a common roadmap. But defining it ourselves, we did not do it. And I think we should not be too lazy in this respect and understand that probably the order of items on the transatlantic agenda will be different for good. I don't think security will come first in the decades to come. I think probably climate will come first in our cooperation. I think trade and the common relation to China will probably come second, if I have to risk a hierarchy. And probably security will come behind, I would think, just to open the discussion. But we should not, again, be, as Europeans, passive about this EU roadmap and the definition we would like to promote of a transatlantic roadmap in the years to come. We should take the initiative. We are not used to that, but let's try in the coming months. We have probably a few months of COVID-focused situation during which we can prepare the common agenda for the post-crisis world. Thank you.
Thank you. Clément. Franziska Brantner, indeed, to get back to Mark's remarks, it's fascinating to see to what extent German public opinion has moved away from the US, and at the same time, how much European public opinion on the whole is looking towards Berlin for some sort of leadership, not vision. That's not really, that's a French word, not necessarily a word Berlin likes to use. So is there still some embarrassment at the idea that Germany should play its role to the fullest? And to what extent do you subscribe to the 3 boxes that Clément Beaune just outlined for us?
Yeah, many thanks for the invitation, and salut Clément. So I think that the survey shows well that Europeans want Europe to get its act together, and that they are waiting and looking for Germany to do its part to do this. And I think that citizens actually are farther than we as politicians, or many European politicians, that we are still not ready to do that and take that step necessary to build up more European capability and capacities to do what our citizens expect us. And I think that's what I took from the study, Mark, is that, you know, if we did listen better, we would be able to advance faster. And let me put it to a couple of points, because I think, you know, our citizens expect Europe to deliver. And Clément, you mentioned the vaccine issue. And the study was done in Germany in November 2020. I'm not sure if you would ask today how many more decliners we would have, because also in Germany, the question of why don't we have enough vaccination doses is quite big and high on the agenda. And I think that if we look at where do we need to get our act together, also in relation to the US, I would see health as a big one up there. You also mentioned it's one of the difficult ones, Clément, but I think that we as Europeans really have to work on this and get better. And it's hard to explain that we cannot produce enough vaccination doses in Europe, that we are such a highly industrialized country, and it takes us so long. And we have to look more at the Americans, how they did it with BARDA and their institutions, and get inspired by the US, I would say, and hope that we can cooperate on this. But we must look beyond this one pandemic and really build on this for the future. Second point where I think we have to deliver is the digital area. And there you mentioned it might also be difficult with the US. I still hope that we might get a joint framework for the regulation of social platforms, social media, etc., that we can do it together. If we can't do it, then we as Europeans should do it by ourselves. But I think that's sort of a standard where we have to reach as Europeans, really the protection of our own data and the infrastructure. And there I see that Germany really needs to deliver. We still have the debate around Huawei, where I still think that Germany has to deliver a European response, and where I don't like the current German government stance. Third point is the economic and financial one. You didn't mention it, Clément. You said trade, and I think trade is right. But we will have to see how we can invest in our own economy during the next couple of years. It will be tough. I mean, we will have big economic problems, and how do we deal with it as Europeans? Can we deliver? I still believe that there are question marks, even though we have the recovery fund, which is a great success, but we will have to be able to show that it's well spent and that we can get through possible crises coming after this one. And I would like to see the euro to become and get a more international role. And Germany also has to deliver for this one. I'm fighting for this inside Germany. It doesn't make me always popular, but I think this is where Germany has to really also deliver on this question of economic strength in the entire EU. And a point which I think is important is the climate one. You mentioned it as a possible avenue of cooperation. I think totally right. We shouldn't do it as Europeans against the US, for example, on border adjustment. We should try to do it together as a transatlantic climate zone, climate trade zone, and then open it up for others. But there also we as Europeans have to deliver, and we as Germans, I just put the word Nord Stream 2 out there, because if we talk about climate change and energy, then we as Germans also have to deliver on a European perspective and a transatlantic one. They're actually transatlantic and European is the same if it comes to German decision making. And on the military one, you mentioned it. My impression is that in the public, we do trust Americans less, or maybe, as your polling shows, Mark, but in the political scene in Berlin, many still do trust their American counterparts more than their French ones. And I really think that there is a question of how well do we know our French colleagues? How well do we know what they really want? There were questions, Clément, about France just wants to be Europe, to be a big France. That's still the image many have of France. And I think that we have been working on this, creating the German-French Assembly to create more exchange, but that we certainly will need even more. And that France will have to say more clearly which substantive goals it wants to achieve with the European strategic sovereignty. That we have less in Germany the impression that it's just about making France bigger. And I think that's would be very helpful for us in Germany to have this debate, because I think we need to debate this together. What do we want to use it for? Make it less abstract, say, what is it for? Why do we need it? Why do we need this capability? And if we could have such a joint debate, I think it would be less Germany, France, the US, but do it together. And, I haven't been surprised by the survey, Mark, on this one point that in the end, the French do trust Americans more, or are closer than Germans on some of these points. When you look at history, after all, France and the US have always been on the side of liberal democracies, Germany far away. But, France and the US were always on the right side. So I think there is also a very long French-American tradition that we as Germans often do not see, but which exists as soon as you know the French scene better and the American scene as well. So, I think sometimes we have in Germany this feeling of we're the transatlanticists and all others are not. It's often, I think, much more diverse.
Thank you. Thank you, Franziska. Maybe as we don't have that much time, unfortunately, maybe we could concentrate on this notion of European sovereignty, which after all does come through the data that Mark was talking about. So many Europeans who think that, we have to take care of ourselves. So European sovereignty could be the concept, maybe a bit too French, but could be the concept for, at least for this discussion. And it is interesting that the political agenda will force German politicians. You have your general elections in September. We have a presidential election next year, which coincides with the French presidency of the EU. So, Clément, what would be the best way for that European sovereignty concept to sound less French and more European?
Thank you very much. I would say two things in this respect. The first one is about the concepts, the words themselves. I was very surprised, or not surprised, but struck, I would say, by the fact that in the last European Council, for instance, which was the first one to discuss about security and defense after Mr. Biden's election, there was again this debate about not sovereignty in this case, but strategic autonomy, which is sometimes the other key word used in Brussels discussion. I'm not sure it's very clear, but it is highly discussed. And there was several hours of discussion on how we should phrase it. Should we use it again or not? You know that the German Minister of Defense, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, said that strategic autonomy was an illusion right after the election in the US. I don't think it was fully shared even in the ruling coalition in Berlin, but whatever, it says something about the sensitivity of this word. And again, we spent hours, sometimes days, about trying to redefine it. Where, not being naive, but I do think that when you talk about the substance behind this concept, especially in the areas of defense and security, the idea that, to put it more simply, Europe should do more, the EU should do more, or member states should do more, spending more in defense investments, capacities, trying to be more autonomous in some concrete areas, cyber attacks, what we do, of course, with the French focus, but in Sahel, in Mali, we should recognize it's an increasing support. Maybe it's not enough, probably it's not enough, but an increasing support by European allies and partners. When we look at the substance, we are closer than we think. And when you look at the substance, we see that France is not this anti-NATO, anti-American ally. We actually take part in a lot of NATO initiatives to ensure the security of Baltic countries, for instance. We have soldiers there, just like the UK, just like Germany and others. We are very active in a lot of NATO exercises. And on the contrary, we should not see us in Paris, in France. Other Europeans are as crazy pro-Americans who do not care about doing something at the European level. It's not true. So the truth is probably a bit more concrete than that. Of course, there are divergences, differences in the relation to the US, in the relation to NATO, that's for sure. But the level of convergence, I think, has increased a lot. And we should not be we should not take distance from the substance because of concepts that are not clear. Just a second remark quickly of this, that the idea of sovereignty, to use the word, if we define it simply as the ability to defend our common interests, our common values, I think has, whatever the exact word used, has made progress. The substance has made progress. We see it in the survey that Mark and ECFR presented. We see it in other recent surveys. When we compare European countries, it's quite striking. I think the way to convince more is, again, not to lose too much time in the semantic, as we say in French, in the wording, and to spend more time in doing what I think has been a big change in the French approach to European diplomacy since 2017, not sufficient, but going in the right direction, trying to talk to everyone, which might seem obvious. It has not been the case, and I'm serious about that, it has not been the case in the French European diplomacy for ages, probably dating back to Mitterrand, who had a very active bilateral European diplomacy in a different context. But just to take this example, which I think I shared before with Christine or Franziska, is that when President Macron went to Finland, which is not the other side of the world, to Finland, 2 years ago now, it was the first bilateral visit since 1987. When President Macron, the day before, was in Denmark for a state visit, it was the first French state visit in Copenhagen since 1982, which you may say it's protocol or symbols, maybe, but I think it says something more about the way we have to try to create this relationship. Why it was, as an initial remarks, underlining this sad to see, but true reality that a lot of European countries look to Berlin more than to Paris. It's because on these concepts and others, we did not do the necessary efforts to discuss, to convince, and to create coalitions and compromises.
Franziska, I know you have to leave us a bit early, so let me turn to you before I turn back to Mark. You mentioned, and I think it's on every people's list of priorities, health as an obvious issue which had never been considered at the European level as being worthy of attention, really. It has all changed. The fact that the Biden administration refuses to export the AstraZeneca vaccines that they have paid for, but still that vaccine is not authorized by the federal authorities in the US, but the administration doesn't want to export those. Mind you, it's maybe less interesting now that Germany and France and other European countries have decided to suspend for a while the use of the AstraZeneca. But what kind of tools should the EU forge in the short term, medium term, so as to keep promoting a more unified approach to health issues? And for that, it needs tools. The reason why the whole operation so far hasn't been an enormous success, to put it politely, is that we just don't have the proper tools.
Yeah, thank you, Christine, for that question. One has to remind everybody that the member states refused for years to give the EU more competence on it. We have a highly integrated system when it comes to the health of animals. You know, when we have the swine flu and whatever, then we have an entire system that starts and trickles down. We have nothing when it comes to our human health. And that must be criticized looking backwards, that member states refuse to share competences on health. And we need to really fix that. I think, you know, if we don't see it in that pandemic, that health has a European dimension, we really do a mistake. On the question, what needs to be done? You know, the problem is, Christine, that we cannot complain about the US not exporting to the EU if we don't export to Australia. You know, if we allow Italy not to export to other countries, or, you know, then we're not any better than the US.
Well, sorry to interrupt, but I think there have been some exports. And it's actually the New York Times which had to do the investigation to find that out.
No, we do export, but we also have now the option, and we do use it, of export limitations on vaccinations. And I think if the understanding is we all put export limitations, then we are screwed. And I think the only answer really is to increase the production capacity. And when we talk about increasing production capacity, I'm not just talking about tools and instruments, I'm talking about ideology. And I think that's part of, in the German mindset. We were proposing last year, March, that we have to set up economics of the pandemics, that we really need to have a different mindset of how a state has to manage economic, delivery chains in times of a pandemic. And we were called communists and, you know, whatever. And I was always saying, I just would like to do it the way the US is doing it, nothing more. I just want the US, you know, the US way to handle it, to be the European way. And this was an ideological blockade in Europe, not just in Germany, in Europe. It wasn't about the instruments. We didn't dare to go the American way of going into every single chain of delivery to say, you build now this construction site, building company, and you stop building the private house. That's what they're doing in the US. If I suggest doing this in Germany, I become, you know, you're crazy leftist. And I think we Europeans have to get this act together, because it won't be the last. We will need vaccination next year. We have to go into each production step, the lipids, you know, the folio that you need to transport it, every single step. And I think we have to go beyond this, look at the medication, medical equipment. Which one are we very dependent on one country? How can we diversify? How can we make sure we have more countries that we export from, and not just China and not just India, any country in the world? We can have health partnerships with African countries. Why don't we do a partnership with Tunisia on production of medical equipment that is tissue? Tunisia used to have a textile industry and is in terrible shape right now. Why don't we build up as Europeans these partnerships? There are so many opportunities in it. And I don't want us to complain about China or Russia doing their geopolitical part about it if we are just not doing it.
Thank you, Franziska, and thank you very much for your contribution. Mark, the survey was conducted, as you said, was conducted in the fall last year. That is to say, to what extent, in your view, would the data differ today, considering the priorities that both Franziska and Clément have underlined?
Well, I don't know. We're going to do some more polling later in the year so we can see how people's views change. But what we have noticed over the last 2 years of polling is quite a big shift in terms of how Europeans think about the world and how they think about themselves. And I think that COVID has definitely had an enormous geopolitical impact on how the public thinks about the world, because people felt, I think, a profound sense of loneliness as the crisis erupted, and they realized that they couldn't rely on their own governments dealing with something as big as COVID all on their own, which I think led to a kind of surge of interest in European action. We also saw people absolutely horrified at the way that Donald Trump and the Chinese were dealing with the response to the crisis, which led to a collapse in people's confidence in those two powers. This poll, I think, shows that it wasn't simply a question of Trump, that there are bigger questions which people are asking about the direction of travel in the United States. And it shows that, happy though many people were about Joe Biden's election in the US, we do need to reinvent the transatlantic relationship rather than assuming that we can immediately go back to where we were before Trump came in. And I think that's really a big challenge for us, how we have a more sovereign Europe that's able to deal with all the issues that we've been talking about healthcare, about the future of our economy, about climate change, about other issues, and to make common cause with Biden's America. But that's a different kind of transatlantic relationship, which has to be built around the issues of the future, how to deal with digital, how to deal with climate change, how to deal with China. And Europeans are going to have to be much more active and much more able to look after their regional problems than we have been in the past, because the US is obviously focusing on big power shifts in the world, and are not going to be able to play the sort of role that they played in the 90s or in the immediate post-Cold War years. And that, I think, is a healthy situation for Europeans to take more responsibility, and for us also to think about the transatlantic relationship in this wider global context, because that's the other thing that's changing apart from the issues we're talking about. We're also looking at how we build relationships with other powers like the Japanese, like the Koreans, like the Indians, and how we start rebuilding the multilateral system after the battering that it's taken from all of these sovereigntist great powers over the last few years.
Franziska, if you have time, there's one question addressed to you by Thomas Hanke from Handelsblatt. So I'm glad that between Germans you use us to talk to one another. And the question is as follows. It's a key one. The elephant in the green room is defense. If Europe has to do more, how much more, where, with whom, which programs, and are the Greens on board?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I will answer it. Our green answer is that we want to do it in a European way. We believe that we need to build a European defense industry, that we have to get away from the national perspectives that we have these days, which create, not really functioning systems and at very high price. Our approach is not to go by a percentage of national gross product, like Germans have to spend 2%, etc., on national based, because we don't believe that if we go it in a national way, we will get European capabilities we need. So our approach is not to take the 2% national, but to say, what are the European capabilities we need to be in Mali, to be, in a UN mission in Sudan, South Sudan? What capabilities do we need, and what do we need to produce for that together? And that might be more expensive than 2%, the same or less. I don't know. But our approach is to define the capabilities we need and then get them. And then let's be more concrete. When we talk German-French, SCAF, the big projects, let's get them done. I don't think that our defense minister is doing a really good job there. I think there is so much friction going on in these projects. And if we screw them, we will buy American. And I think it would be a mistake. So, you know, if we as Greens, we would probably restart these projects and set them on a good place. Let's be concrete. Let's define the capabilities we need. And therefore, we need to define first what we want to do when it comes to security in Africa. What's our joint strategic vision? Where do we need to defend our interests? What kind of interests, cyber, etc. And I think that's the debate we need to have. And you said it, Clément, let's be concrete. Let's get away from semantics. I could argue why I like sovereignty better than autonomy. Let's get the concrete debate done. And I have the impression that in Germany, we love the semantic debate because it keeps us from going to the concrete. And I hope that the next couple of months till September, we Germans will be forced by our European partners to talk concrete and get away from semantics. And I'm happy to contribute from my side on that and to work on it in a German-French way.
Thank you very much, Franziska. I've thought for a long time that semantics was a French specialty, the obsession with words. But a question for you, Minister Beaune. Can you expand on the new common vision between the US and the EU? What is France's vision when it comes to what would be a new common vision with the US? And let me link it, if I may, Clément, to another question addressed to you. Is it possible to make strategic autonomy more real? And if that is possible, what would you have the EU do first and second?
Thank you. On what I meant at the beginning by this idea of a new transatlantic agenda is I think there are two approaches which are, I think, not irrelevant, but probably out of date. The first one is to expect from Washington the definition of our relation, to put it simply. Of course, in many areas, let's be frank, the US is one power, one country, stronger than us. Even when you look at the defense spending, all 27 together, if I'm correct, we are doing half the spending of the US, which is a big gap. But it's not like 1 to 10 or 1 to 20 as a ratio. So it's not an area in which we are in existence. I think we could be more powerful. The problem is that these big amounts, we do not use it in a fragmented way. We do not use it with a strategy. We do not use it with a vision of our priorities, what we want to do in terms of external operations, are ready to do some or not. Where? Africa, for instance, Sahel, it's a priority for France. I think it's a matter of European security. Are we ready to do more together, not waiting for the US to help us? Cybersecurity, I think it would be crazy to expect from the US to do all the necessary technological investment, military investment to protect ourselves, our democratic processes, which is both a civilian and a military issue, and not act together as Europeans first, and so on and so forth. So we still have this mentality, if I dare to insist on this, of expecting from Washington what is a transatlantic relation. It was very clear, even in symbolic elements that Christine, you know better than anyone. So coverage, the media coverage of the US election is nothing in comparison, I can already predict, with what we will see with in France the German elections in September, or in Germany with the French elections next spring. I think it will be interesting and followed, but not as much as recounting ballots in Wisconsin that we can follow for hours on information channels, in social media, in all our European countries. So just this. Second element is that what I do think, to elaborate a bit on my conclusion as a conclusion of my introduction, is that I think the order of parameters, the order of items will be a bit different in the transatlantic relation. And we should try to define ourselves, EU, what we want, where we want to cooperate most or more with the US. And I think I tried to do this first in a very rough classification, but I do think that climate would be an area of good cooperation, where we have again, maybe a competition of leadership, but not a competition in substance with this new administration. And there is clearly a Biden change in this respect. I mean, never in the past we could say that climate was the first issue of transatlantic cooperation. It might become the situation. Trade, I think, will be even more important than security and defense. That was my point, just to insist on that a bit. I think we missed an opportunity during the Trump era, which was mainly Trump's responsibility, but to be frank, a bit ours as well. We never managed to cooperate on the trade relations to China. We never managed to propose a common reform of WTO, EU, and the US, even though we are the two biggest trading powers. We had some discussions with Japan to promote some elements of reform, never a comprehensive reform of WTO. Probably it was not possible with Mr. Trump. I think we should take this initiative as the EU. It's a common competency of the EU, actually. So we are strong as a club in this respect in trade. We should go to the US and say, here are the 5 elements of a WTO reform: technology transfers, intellectual property, reforms of the panel of judgment and so on, that we should propose to you, US, try to promote together, not against, but toward China, to be strong together. I think this trade relation or strategic relation to go beyond between us on the one hand and China on the other hand will be the huge challenge of the transatlantic relation in the 10 to 12 years, 20 years to come. It will integrate elements of security and defense, most likely, but I think the type of tension, global cooperation we have to address EU and US is now more technology, trade, autonomy in these areas than direct military elements, as we had to deal with when our transatlantic cooperation was about resisting to the USSR or to the Warsaw Pact. Hence the importance of NATO, which will be more limited, I think, in this new era of transatlantic relation. Just on autonomy, one word. That's also one of the reasons why I don't like so much the phrase strategic autonomy, because the strategic is even more vague than autonomy, because I think it's not only about the military dimension, again, because it will not be the only or the central element of the transatlantic partnership, but it's clearly broader than this. Just to take the example of, the topical example of today's crisis, the health crisis, are we autonomous as EU? When we discovered last year, at the beginning of the COVID crisis, that sometimes 2/3 up to, I think, 80% of very basic elements of our health production, medicine production, like paracetamol, is done outside Europe. Are we autonomous when we discovered that we were not able to produce masks, face masks? It's not 5G, it's not high technology, it's like this piece of sophisticated paper. We managed to catch up. So I think we have resources to catch up. But at the beginning, even the US, Europe for sure, we were not able to produce this. And we know the geopolitical consequences of all this, because the Chinese exported masks everywhere in the world saying, we are protecting you, which was a bit of a paradox when we know the origin of this pandemic. Just to say that autonomy for me is a multifaceted element, or sovereignty, whatever word you choose. It's not only defense, more spending in defense, which I think we should do. It's about technologies, it's about production. We rediscover with the vaccine, again, the importance of maybe not producing everything we need and being in a situation of OTC, but to produce more at the European level. And this is, final argument, I think, a strong case for France, for Germany, for Italy, and so on, in the EU to act as Europeans. Because if we want to produce more, to be more autonomous in very concrete industrial areas, we will never do it France alone, Germany alone, Italy or Spain alone. Never. Who can believe that we will produce the whole element of a vaccine tomorrow in France, 100%. But we need to produce it or to innovate for it in Europe, I'm sure.
Thank you very much, Minister Beaune. Mark, the time has come already to wrap up this discussion. So your job.
Well, thank you very much, Christine. Thanks, Clément. we're at time, so I'm not going to say anything more of substance, except to say that we're very much looking forward to carrying on working on these issues. We have big projects, ECFR on European sovereignty, looking at 5 dimensions, at health, at digital, at climate, at security, as well as at what to do on economic issues. We're also going to be doing a lot of work on trying to define what a new transatlantic relationship can look like. And I think that there are lots of great ideas about that which came up today. And we're also going to be working more on trying to understand how to win public support for all of these issues. We will be doing at least 2 more rounds of polling this year at pan-European level, as well as some polls in individual countries. I'm particularly interested to see how the politics evolves in Germany as we move towards the elections in the autumn, and also in France, as well as many of the other countries where we're working. But thank you so much, Christine, for chairing this, and thank you to Clément and to Franziska for a great discussion.
Merci beaucoup. À bientôt.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. Merci.
Au revoir.
Au revoir.
Au revoir.